On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Kevin Trilli. He is the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Amount Financial. We're going to be talking about when the product officer takes on the technology leadership role and kind of the impact in the company, because obviously there's different lenses to look at problems. And Kevin's got a product background and has moved in and has taken on more technology leadership. And we're going to be asking about how that's changed things, his view, how the engineering team works, when does tech debt fit in, and all those type of questions. Hopefully we'll fit in as much as we can with you, Kevin. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me, Amir.
All right. Absolutely. Okay. Amount Financial, what do you guys do over there?
Yeah, we're a B2B fintech. We offer a platform called an origination system, which allows banks, credit unions to offer loan, credit card, and account opening products.
All right. So this episode, I was super excited because obviously you have a great background within technology. You have been a chief product officer before. You've spent a lot of time in the product space. You do have the technology title now at Amount. I guess before we dive in, just to kind of set the stage, tell us a little bit about what that balance looks like with a chief product and technology officer title.
I would say this is the third time I've had to do this, twice in sort of a venture size company and once as a founder of a day zero startup. And I was trying to, as we were thinking about this talk, was try to draw from those experiences in a couple different ways. But basically, you know, as we know, the evolution of software development has sort of bounced, you know, with software engineers and product folks and designers and all this. And at the end of the day, you're making product for your customers. And so, you know, the question then becomes, are you building the right thing? And are you, achieving business goals? And then are you building fast enough to your market with a competitive advantage? Are you developing IP? And all those things that kind of come out on the software execution side. And so when you're thinking about this holistically, you're just naturally fusing those things together in sort of a continuum, which is a very interesting perspective. And I've worked with great CTOs over my career, and I've learned from them, and hopefully they've learned from me, vice versa. But being able to have that as sort of one mindset, I think, is what the topic we want to explore here. And again, if the bottom line kind of shortcut is what you're doing mattering to your customer, to your market, and to your business goals. And if you apply that lens constantly, that's really, whether it's the technology side or, working with what the product features are or whatever, you're always kind of coming back to those principles. So my mind's always, especially with my bias of being I was actually thinking, I'm a CTO Russian doll with a product cover on the outside of it. I'm always applying the same principles all the way through the door, through the doll. And it comes back to that point. So we'll explore that in a couple of different ways as we get into the subtopics here.
And maybe let's start backwards, because I am curious. You mentioned the Russian doll analogy, and obviously that's a great way of looking at it. When it comes to solving a problem, obviously you understand the product side very well. You've been a CTO, you mentioned you've done this a couple of times. When you do see, let's say, customer feedback and you're working with the product team, when does that switch come on and off on the technology side? Because obviously, if there was in your role when you were just a devoted the chief product officer, might be slightly different. So I'm just kind of curious, since you hold both titles and you've done it previously, how does that engagement with the product team differ for you?
Yeah, I know. And there's a principle I want to share, is just really how I run the leadership team underneath me, which is the product and technical side. When both roles aren't consolidated, I actually have a joint staff meeting with the CTO's team once a month and my team the other couple of weeks. And now we do that together every week, obviously. And what I try to paint a perspective is, anyone in that room, if you're not presenting and you're not owning the initiative, think of yourself as the investor. You cannot tune out because it's a product side issue or it's a heavy tech issue. You have to keep thinking in the room actively that this is your company. This is your product overall, capital P. And you need to challenge and debate and understand the business issues and help that person succeed. So if you start with that principle, then everyone at the table is a business person first. They're a technical person second, or whatever the discipline is around the room. So I start with that principle. And then as it comes to your question, everybody owns the customer success. Now, you may have a different role in that, but you may have to represent the holistic view of the product to the customer at a given issue. And the issue can be, hey, the product uptime isn't working, or the customer experience for the end user is not allowing me to go through. I've often talked about this role as chief apology officer. Sometimes you have to, address those issues head on, take the feedback, and bring corrective action. A lot of that corrective action in the near term is usually on the technical side: fix a bug, improve an API that's down, whatever it may be. But the product side is more about a feature follow on or an improper deployment of an idea that's not solving the job to be done. But again, I like to blur those as much as possible so the tech team at minimum drives context out of all these interactions that come up. Every problem is an opportunity to learn about your product, the edge cases of it. And so it sort of flows through in that way. Now, naturally, a pure technical issue, we have led by the technical side of the house. If we're getting 404s or whatever it may be, that's not a product side problem, but it ultimately impacts the happiness of the product and the NPS. So PM should be aware of that, but they're not going to necessarily drive that one. So it sort of bounces naturally. The needs of the customer, the future job to be done and how we complete it, to the actual quality and reliability of the platform. There's a natural spectrum there, but in the middle, there's a lot of overlap that can happen for good leaders on both sides.
Obviously, you mentioned you have a meeting, everyone is present, trying to identify and solve the business problem, take the customer feedback, make sure it is understood. When you are looking at the dynamic of having that ability of understanding the product side, and actually I've talked to a lot of CTOs and engineering leaders, and they said the best ones are the ones that understand the product side very well. And I'm kind of hearing the flip side is that, well, the better you understand the technology side, the better you are as a chief product officer, as a product leader. I guess when we're looking at the customer, we're trying to think about them and the final and end of everything. Is that dynamic of understanding the other side and your role, is that where things are leading to have one person who straddles both? I mean, is the inevitability of keeping these two roles separate, is it based on stage of company, or is there really value even for larger companies to potentially explore the option of having one person hold both these titles?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the folks on my product team, including myself, have an engineering degree or a computer degree of some sort. So they're a technical group that has left the discipline to become, a product or business side person. So I think, not all of them, but a big percentage of them. Some products kind of point to is that some products are naturally more technical than others, API-based products, as an example, versus a B2C website that's, a game or something like that. There's still technology involved, but they'll naturally kind of spread the type of product manager differently across those types of product markets. So I would say, now let's get into the topic of the day of AI as an example. Like, if you're not deeply understanding AI as a technology, whether it be machine learning or LLM, you're not a good product manager at this point, because that's about to change everyone's product holistically, either from underneath or on top. So the better you understand that, the more you're going to understand the trends of your product from the product side. But I think the other observation I've always seen is that there's kind of a third part in the middle here, which is like how products are implemented at a customer, especially in the B2B context. And I always call that the last mile of the product. And oftentimes that sits between engineering and product and an implementation team. But that's where the things all come together to deliver value. And it's usually a very technical interface at that point. How do we use your API? How do we configure this rule in the system? How do we do whatever it may be to set up the system? And if you don't understand the systems that go into that from the product side, you're not going to fully understand your product, nor will you understand your customer's perspective at the product. And I think that's where the training can go both directions to really improve how you're building, because the building side is building with an intent at how something should be used. You're not necessarily seeing how it's actually being implemented. So I think the combination of those things actually bring that pollination together. Whether it's one role, I think there are people that like to code and spend 1% to 5% of their time getting customer feedback. There are other people that want to thirst on figuring out this puzzle of what do my customers want? What is my competition doing? What is the strategy? And don't want to spend all day on technology. I don't think the roles will ever be one function, because you have these disciplines that are personality-based, skill set-based, and preference-based. And frankly, you can't just shift these contexts constantly be effective. It's very difficult.
100%. We see traditionally split apart. I would not imagine it'd be a simple thing for one person to wear both hats. Before I could get past this one question, you mentioned AI. Obviously, everyone's looking at Gen AI, its ability to assist software engineers write some code. I hear software engineers worried that within 5 years what's going to happen in their jobs. You see a lot of unknown. Is there a world where software engineers with the you mentioned a lot of people on the product side have engineering or technical backgrounds? Is there a world where more software engineers need to move into product roles because they understand the fundamentals, but they just don't have to write as much code, and they can be involved in the business more? Is that a scenario that could potentially unfold?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen for sure. I think there's still judgment out about the quality of code and how much it can be used off the shelf versus being fitted in. It's already happening. You're seeing, I think Microsoft came out with their last PR around some percentage of their code being written through AI. So yes. Now, is that the most elegant IP of the company that's being developed there, or is that more of sort of the shared services and different wrappers around it that are less controversial or impactful to the company's code stack? It's going to happen, and I think that empowers folks to think more about newer areas where they can build code, not necessarily leaving coding completely. Now, play that out further. I mean, I would assume that's going to happen. You can, just like an LLM today, you can discuss what you're trying to do. Write me, here's the spec, go write the code for it. Sure. I think we had a while to go on that one. So I think it allows us to go further and further up the value stack first. And also, as you said, maybe understand the context of the market more as a developer, which, some companies encourage that already and have been encouraging that. Others like to say, just give us the spec and we'll build the spec. And I think that's the big difference you'll see in the audiences is does that second audience remain like that? Or are they just going to be kind of gradually moved over into all good coders have some percentage of their job understanding the context of the market? That's most likely the scenario.
Yeah, interesting, because I think we're going to go through a process and period of it being very technical until tools will be built to simplify some of this. I mean, I know years ago, rules engines were being developed to try to do some of this stuff, and there's a lot of friction. It wasn't the easiest, but also that was because computers quite didn't interpret rules engines as elegantly as they might with the large language model. So we'll see. We still got. We'll come back to that one. Obviously, everyone who's talking about it, we'll come back. You mentioned obviously, if the engineering team understands, the engineering leadership needs to understand what business needs. When it comes to actually the engineering team delivering at a better clip, better output, is understanding that product piece helping that fold in a little bit more when you are interfacing with the technology leadership? Does that happen more because you have both titles? Is that just a byproduct of happening to see both things slightly differently? Is there an impact at all?
Well, I would say the first thing I would do that is sort of fuse the roles together is sort of the product vision and the architecture. And, the more you can operate at that level to go, okay, what's our product vision, and run a process to define that and kind of think, 5 years out kind of thing, and define the why we would matter, why we deliver good value to our customers, why we'll win, and then what it looks like to some degree. The architecture should therefore behind that serve that vision, right? And deliver the product and the set of services around that to help you achieve that vision as a company. And then you kind of get into the back and forth of what each box in the architecture really means, and, kind of drilling down into that. So I think that's sort of like stage one, where you would operate to add the most value of really questioning, do these things allow the vision to happen? Then below that is what you're bringing up, is a little bit around the execution. Okay, now does that architectural structure fit the execution pace, the agility that we want to be in the market? And of course, being right the first time as much as you can while running a marathon at full speed. Simple problem for engineering to figure out. And so I think that's the next level you go down to, of then asking some questions around, where are we today in terms of our delivery frequency? Where are we today in terms of our quality metrics? Where is the reliability of the platform? And establish the business outcomes, again, business side of my head, and apply that into the tech team to say, now, can you map in these design principles that are going to get to these business goals and product vision? And you sort of taper it down further and further, and eventually I'll hit a wall where I've not, developed XYZ personally of this types of system, and I'll rely on my team for bringing the technical esoterics of that system in, the why we would need to use that particular system, why we need to improve at the technical debt and turn the knob up a little bit more because the system's end of life, or we need to implement this new technology here, or we want to move gradually up the maturity of the company at the architectural level, which is the whole collection of services that you use, and kind of move into some of the different mechanisms that are, enable more out of the platform. So all this has to come down to that. What's the business reason for it? You're not just building a platform without a product. I always like to say it's there to deliver the product. Now, the platform can be a differentiator for you in the market, especially when you get to some of these older companies that have legacy stacks, acquired companies, didn't integrate them, and they get sort of molasses-like in terms of their ability to execute. An unbelievably sharp modern architecture that's got these principles can become a differentiator for being in the market and disrupting and winning. That's where that becomes super important.
When we talk about product and then we talk about technology, obviously the feedback loop is very important. Is there any difference if we were to compare, a chief product and a chief technology officer being in two different particular roles versus it being unified in this case? Is the feedback loop the same? Is there any differences in how that's processed?
I mean, it's simpler, obviously, because there's one person and the problems row themselves upstream. So typically it starts at that level usually. But I think, watching the CTO from the side and now kind of serving the role today, oftentimes when there's a problem, a customer wants to hear it directly from the CTO, who's the delivery accountability agent ultimately for the code at the end. The product person's all about what we're going to build and why, and how do we build this feature and kind of address your need. But ultimately, a lot of the problems that pop up, the feedback that you're referring to, come down to the system's performance or the ability of the code to not have bugs. And that's where ultimately you've got to have the CTO hat or the CTO own that, because that's the ultimate delivery output agent of the company, and the accountability stops there. So I think feedback like that traditionally doesn't flow all the way to the CPO unless the CPO is owning the full product experience and has a relationship with the customer. I'll oftentimes be on the call with the CTO. Some of those particular topics come CTO first and don't even come over to the product side, usually from your customer success org and this and that. So I think that's kind of where you get some of that. The technical feedback, I think, generally is coming, not necessarily, I mean, it kind of rolls into aggregate levels from customer feedback, but it also comes out a lot about this, thinking about the maturity of our platform, thinking about the performance metrics. I mean, those are pretty well understood and defined. So there's less of that feedback that comes through customers. It's usually like your system's not performing well, it's too slow, it's down, or this issue's come up with quality.
Is your view on technical debt? I guess this is maybe a question I was kind of curious about, because obviously, I mean, you could define, everyone can have their own definition of technical debt, but there's some common baselines we could just, kind of work with here. But I guess when it comes to technical debt and prioritization of the roadmap and those short-term potential decisions that sometimes are trade-offs that are made, do you see things differently, having responsibility for both, or do you try to keep them as separate in your mind as you can?
Historically, I've always trusted my CTO, and that builds through relationship and, lots of, day-to-day interaction and judgment and just kind of building mutual respect for each other. Once you get to that point and there's a request for XYZ, feature, upgrade a system, take it to a new version, or spend some time extra on quality, usually that's coming out of not the intent to build the better mousetrap, but because that person's judgment has signaled it's time to do this. So I've been sort of born from trust. And I think what I've often said is, look, let's agree on an allocation of time, 10%, 25%, whatever the number is. Let's keep it as low as possible, knowing the business pressure of that's not going to unlock revenue, or that's not going to achieve, new customers. That's going to be keeping us happy. And you start thinking about risk management. Then I'll ask a second question. How long does our current platform have to live? Architecturally, performance-wise, which then you bring out those things I mentioned earlier around speed to build a feature, quality, time in QA versus time in development, and then reliability. And if we can avoid as much as possible a big bang replatforming, which oftentimes happens when you build a V1, then I'm happy because the roadmap doesn't get shut down at that point to a high degree. Like maybe up to 50% tech debt needs to be done to re-platform. I'll put that in that bucket. So you have to avoid that big bang problem. You have to allocate a set amount of resource to tech debt proactively, and you need to guide it with business principles and outcomes. And then I think to your direct question, as it changed, I feel consistent with what I believe, thankfully. Hopefully I trust myself, but I trust my leadership team on the way they've been more business context aware to then realize that every unit of tech debt, is a trade-off of 3x on product feature or whatever it may be, but also can prevent a 5x risk management problem of replatforming. So that's where I'll really push them on their thinking of how do we minimize the tech debt allocation, but prevent these outcomes and really judiciously stay ahead of the curve.
That's a great viewpoint. And as you're kind of speaking, I was thinking about you going back to mentioning it's really about the business problem, the business need, understanding how to solve that. Is there, I guess, a component in your mind when you do look at tech debt and you look at the business value? Do you value the business solution over the elegance of the engineering solution? And the reason I'm asking is sometimes tech debt is nuanced between different engineering teams because it also is nuanced by the person driving the technology, the architecture, those decisions, right? There's a billion ways of doing these things, and how elegant the solution needs to be versus how functional it needs to be are two different questions. But if we're really focused on business value, obviously sustainability and management, all those things do come into play, but there is a component of, hey, let's still there's value, and the engineering elegance isn't as important. I guess, how do you view that?
That's a great nuanced question. The platform should enable capabilities. And that's essentially what the tech engine is doing, is allowing you to build product and deliver product and service. And what you want is the ability to enable that as much as you can to be as flexible to what the business needs. I'll counter that with most businesses that you want to be part of are growing. And so there's a constant trade-off to building to unlock and building to maintain and prevent risk problems. Now, risk is its own category, as I described, and you just have to address that and fund that to a non-zero number. But what you're describing is you're usually having to do this in a way that velocity is critical, and you're making constant trade-offs in that process. And some of those are quick decisions you have to make in the moment and hope they're not a one-way door, as they say, later down the road, and you've got to go figure out a new door to go through because you've made an architectural fundamental problem. So I think it's always that classic problem of like, are we sensing any problems here that are one-way doors? If not, let's go through it and throw it into throw the body in the tech debt pile, and then we'll work on it later. Because you can, and that becomes part of your trade-off of going fast. Now, this always comes back to the quality of your engineer, the quality of your architect, and the decisions you're making at that moment. And that's why everyone is in competition for these really high capable technical professionals, because those decisions are downstream years of implication to it. So I can't say that it's speed only and it's business only, because you have to have some balanced view. And I think maybe that's one of the things I'll be even further educated by doing both roles, of like a little bit more of judgment on what those one-way door decisions are.
And that's really interesting, because I'm really glad you said that, because I think when I see this joint title, I think those one-way door decisions, sometimes when product has a high need that isn't maybe a long-term, but it is a short-term return, and it's crucial to the company. I think it's interesting because on the technical side, I think there's you might go do, but you're doing it with some corners cut, and it kind of weighs on you as an engineer. Weighs on you. You're like, I know this is cutting a corner. I don't like this, but I'm doing it. And you start worrying about it. And it is very interesting because while it might be a short-term solution from the product viewpoint, it might end up being a long-term one-way door, because it might scale, and you're like, well, how am I going to replace this? And we've seen companies that go through that, and all of a sudden, their success leads to their downfall, because all of a sudden this thing wasn't supposed to be a crucial component. So that's a very interesting problem to deal with.
I've seen it both ways, let's say that. And I've seen roadmaps get greatly impacted because some of those decisions that seemed right at the first time, but businesses can change also, and the needs of the business can shift, and suddenly those assumptions were not the correct assumptions to make, or they were just some bad decisions that were made. Let's say the other side of it too, and you just took too many shortcuts and didn't push back enough on product and say, we actually need the extra month to do this right this time. And once we do that, we've laid that version 0.9 or 1.0 framework for then building the actual feature. That's the way you normally see those things communicated, and you just got to accept that. Everything in product development is at least a year. It's usually 5 years, right? If you think about the implication of a given feature. So, to take an extra month on that and make sure you don't have these kind of issues or de-risk them as much as you can is a no-brainer, in my opinion.
Awesome, Kevin. I love the topic. I love the conversation. I think it's, we touched on Gen AI. We probably need to do a second one of these and factor in if code automation starts taking off, and how do we actually start looking at some of the product question, the feedback question, also tech debt. That's what I'm very curious about. So maybe we'll have to have you on and continue the conversation on that. I know we kind of are bumping up against our time here, and I did want to thank you for taking the time to be on. If somebody does want to reach out and kind of pick your brain on anything you mentioned, what is a good way of connecting with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's the easiest way, and making reference to this as your inbound source, I'd be happy to respond back and have a chat.
Awesome. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Amir. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Thanks for the chat.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Two things until then. One, I really think there's an interesting dynamic when you combine the product and technology officer role. I do hear from some technology leaders that do take on some of the product, and their viewpoints change. I think Kevin has a very distinctly different viewpoint as well. And I do think in both cases, Kevin actually called this out, that really it's about servicing the business need and being able to understand slightly a little bit more of the whole view of the org. And I think that is a very interesting point. Please share this episode with somebody else who might also benefit from listening to Kevin's feedback and insights. I think that'd be great. Also, like, subscribe, comment, leave me a review on the podcast. Let me know how things are going. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.